Hey everybody, this is Becca. Thanks for watching my channel. Today we're going to be building what I'm calling the Gothic Monstrosity, and it's a monstrosity because usually I like to do a little research on the build to get a flavor for like the style, look at some reference images, but I just wanted to build a spooky mess, and so that's what this is going to be, and it goes in Forgotten Hollow on the lot where the Notorious live, and like it's just like a total wreck of styles. So here's the build footage, and I'm going to be talking to you today about murder. That's right. Murder most foul, because this is spooky season, and that applies no matter if you watch this in October or literally any time of the year, because I think spooky stuff should be a year-round trend. So, the story of a murder that rocked the nation and ended up influencing American Gothic writers Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. The crime in question was the murder of an 82-year-old guy named Captain Joseph White, and it happened on April the 6th, 1830. So Joseph White was a ridiculously wealthy guy, and he had a fabulous mansion in downtown Salem. He was a shipmaster and a trader, but guess what this a-hole traded in? And here's your hint when I tell you, you're not really going to feel too bad about the fact that he was freaking murdered. So yeah, he was a slave trader. For some historical context, owning slaves had been abolished in the state of Massachusetts by 1783, and the slave trade had been outlawed here totally 5 years later. But that didn't stop Joseph White. Although he had some legitimate businesses as well, he publicly boasted after all the slavery had been outlawed that he had, quote, no reluctance in the selling of any part of the human race. So, in addition to literally being a slave trader, he was also a jerk in general, and he had a reputation for being like nasty and especially abusive to servants and the lower classes. So we're gonna call his murder delayed karma, if you will. But anyways, the murder was pretty brutal. So it happened like this. Captain White lived alone in his big stately mansion except for his niece and a couple of servants. He went to bed about 9:40. At 6 a.m. the next morning, a servant got up and noticed that a window had been left open and it was propped up with a board. Now, Captain White was known for keeping a huge iron chest full of gold doubloons in his bedroom because he was apparently just like Scrooge McDuck. So the servant was afraid that somebody had come in overnight to rob the house, so he alerted everybody else and he went upstairs, and that's where he found White's body on the bed. Obviously he'd been smacked brutally on the head, and he also had some stab wounds, so like he was clearly dead. But curiously, all of the valuables, including the chest of gold coins, had not been touched. Outside the window, footprints had been found before the police arrived, and the dead man's nephew, who was named Stephen White, thought to preserve them, so he put a pan over them to protect them from the weather. However, unfortunately, then as now, police incompetence was prevalent, and no one cared to take a plaster cast of the footprints, which like wasn't exactly standard practice in the 1830s, but it wasn't unheard of. The body was thoroughly autopsied though, and that was uncommon for this time. But the guy was like so rich, and people were shocked that what seemed to be like this poor old white man had been murdered in cold blood in his bed. So it was a huge story, and the newspapers, you know, were very interested. They made him seem nicer than he was, and this is kind of how it made national news. So the autopsy revealed that his skull had been crushed, pretty obvious, and he had been stabbed 13 times. The initial autopsy findings suggested that there had been one single killer, but they had another autopsy done, and that report suggested two. This is important for later, so remember that. Basically, there were no clues about the case if we forget about the footprints, which no one, used. So the town let local citizens form a task force. It was called the Vigilance Committee, and they were authorized to search any house and interrogate every individual that they thought could be related to the murder. The members took an oath of secrecy, and there was a $1,000 reward for any information that was like related to the murder. So that's kind of crazy. They had a vigilante committee. Anyways, the townspeople were all riled up, and they started carrying extra weapons and roaming the streets because some of Captain White's family members had also been questioned, and two men whose names were Joseph and Frank Knapp, they were in-laws to Captain White, had testified that the night of their murder, their carriage had been attacked by assailants when they were traveling between Salem and another town called Wenham. So people thought that there was basically a band of very violent thieves and assassins lurking around the town. However, when there weren't any more attacks, the theory came to be that because everybody knew what like a big terrible grump this old guy was, and because it was unpopular to be in the slave trade at this time in Massachusetts history, that the murder had been more about his personality, especially when you consider that it had been his habit to write and rewrite his will and cut out whatever relative had gotten on his nerves or offended him. So, a break in the case came when 70 miles away, in a town called New Bedford, a man was arrested for petty thievery, and he had a tip. He claimed that he'd been in a gambling house when he had overheard 2 local brothers conspiring to murder Captain White. The 2 brothers in question were named Richard and George Crowninshield. Weirdly, they were members of the Salem upper class. Their family was pretty rich, but they were well-known troublemakers. Richard, in particular, was known for his vices. He was a gang leader. He participated in organized crime, and he was running a gambling hall in Salem. For some family history, he and his brother George had come from an abusive family, but they'd always been close, with Richard protecting George from the worst of his father's abuse. So you would think, knowing this reputation about the brothers, that maybe they would have had run-ins with the law before, but they hadn't, maybe due to interference from their rich family. So anyways, they were taken to jail, and Richard, the older brother in particular, was not concerned. There was no evidence against him besides this rumor that had just come from a thief. So Richard played it cool. He wrote poetry. He had books delivered to him about mathematics and the classics, while they sat in jail, and the police looked for some hard evidence. Well, they finally got some hard evidence thanks to a blackmailer who was trying to extort 2 men, Joseph and Frank Knapp, whose names you might recall from earlier because they had an alibi of our carriage was attacked on the night of the murder. The would-be blackmailer had sent a note to the Knapp house asking for money or he would reveal what he knew. However, the note had been received by Joseph Knapp Sr., not Jr., so it was Frank Knapp Jr. who had married into Captain White's family. Joseph Sr. consulted his sons, who were Dad, it's a scam, don't worry about it. But with his nerves rattled, Joseph Knapp Jr., there's no other way to put this, fucked up royally. He advised his father to send the note to the Vigilance Committee and then forged some notes of his own, which he asked a friend to put into the mail. In the notes that he wrote, he made it look like the blackmailer, who was using a fake name, had been paid to murder Captain White by Captain White's nephew, Stephen White, the one who covered the footprints earlier. So this backfired royally. The Vigilance Committee managed to track down the blackmailer, and the blackmailer was ready to spill everything in order to not be associated with the terrible murder. And the friend who put the notes in the mail for Knapp realized something weird was going on and then told the Vigilance Committee about the errand that he'd been asked to do. So Joseph Knapp and Frank Knapp were taken to jail. Joseph confessed everything. He and his brother had apparently hired the Crowninshield brothers to make Captain White's murder happen because they thought that if there was no will found, that White's fortune would be distributed equally among his relatives, including Joe Knapp's mother-in-law, the niece of Captain White. So they negotiated to pay the Crowninshields $1,000, which was way more money back then, to do the actual murder because they didn't have the stomachs to beat an old guy to death. So what happened was that Joseph visited White's house to see his mother-in-law, who lived there with her uncle. He stole the key to the big chest full of gold, which was also the chest where White kept his will. He left a window unlocked so Richard Crowninshield could sneak in and do the actual murdering, which, by the way, Richard did with a murder weapon that he had crafted himself and was reportedly quite proud of. So Joseph was able to tell the cops where the murder weapon was hidden. They found it. Richard Crownshield's fate was sealed. And the whole crime was for absolutely no reason because, as you may have guessed, this was not how inheritance law worked. And besides that, Captain White had a copy of his most recent will on file with his lawyer, and his nephew, Stephen White, was the one who inherited everything. Another strange quirk of the law was that back then in a murder case, you had to have the principal found guilty before you could try the accomplices. So Richard, probably trying to protect his brother and possibly his friends, the Knapp brothers, took his own life in jail, which then threw the prosecution into a crisis. However, due to the conflicting autopsy reports that I mentioned earlier about how many murderers there were, the prosecution was able to get off by then saying that Joseph Knapp actually helped do the murder, and so he and his brother Frank were hanged. George Crown and Shield, Richard's brother, got off because it seemed like although he knew about the crime, he did not participate. Plus, he had the alibi of being with some ladies of the night at the time. So his brother's, self-sacrifice kind of worked there. And if you're wondering about how the blackmailer knew the details of the crime, it's because he was friends with Richard and George, and these two idiots told him everything about the plan. So that's the story of Salem's famous murder. You can visit the house where it happened, and the cudgel that was used by Richard Crown and Shield is actually owned by the Peabody Essex Museum. They don't display it, but I think they let people look at it sometimes. There are rumors that the Parker brothers were inspired in the American edition of Clue by the Captain White's murder house, but I can't find anything about this. I've just heard some tour guys say it, and I think it's fake, and the only relevance is that the Parker brothers factory was actually in Salem when they acquired Clue, which had been Cluedo in the UK. Anyways, that's the story, so let me know if you liked it, if you have any questions about it. If you did like it, please consider subscribing to this channel because every sub helps, and I hope to see you again soon.